In this mini lecture, I'm going to be discussing the history of psychology. I'm going to highlight some key historical figures as well as the main scientific movements within psychology that gave rise to the field as we know it today. And so these uh, fields, these scientific movements are structured in order of how early they came in the development of psychology. So the first movement was structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that the mind is best studied when it's studied in its individual parts and its individual components. And structuralism was really led by Wilhelm Wundt, who is commonly referred to as the father of psychology. He was a German psychologist who established an experimental psychology lab that really focused on identifying the different elements of consciousness: attention, intelligence, memory, all the different parts of the mind, and trying to measure them. His work largely focused on introspection. He would get research participants to think deeply about the different things going on in their mind at a given time, and trying to identify different parts of them. And so he was really the first person who showed that consciousness could be studied in scientific fashion. He had two prominent students or individuals who studied with him and eventually came to the US. Edward Titchener, who was one of the first psychologists in the US, who helped spread the study of structuralism and establish 40 experimental psychology labs in North America, as well as Margaret Floy Washburn, who was one of Titchener's students, who became the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology in the world. Uh, After structuralism, another movement that appeared was functionalism. And functionalism was really the alternative to structuralism and really the counterpoint. So structuralists like Wilhelm Wundt, they argued that we should study the components of the mind. They wanted to identify what specific cognitive abilities exist. Whereas in functionalism, the idea behind functionalism was that we should study the mind as a whole, and because the whole mind is important in examining what the purpose of these individual mental abilities is. Really, the perspective was we need to study the whole mind so that we can understand how the mind helps individuals function in their environment. And so the key figures in functionalism were William James, who was really the father of American psychology, and really most prominently argued that the consciousness should be studied as a whole, as well as G. Stanley Hall, who became the first president of the American Psychological Association, and really was one of the early pioneers in psychology in the United States, with much of his work focusing on child development and education. So structuralism and functionalism were two of the early movements in psychology. Next came behaviorism, and we touched on this briefly in the previous mini lecture. Behaviorists like John Watson and B.F. Skinner, they really focused on studying observable behaviors. Their ultimate goal was to see how they could predict behavior in certain situations, as well as possibly and hypothetically how behavior could be controlled among the masses. And so they really argue that unobservable mental processes, thoughts, emotions, intelligence, memory, these kinds of things that go on inside our heads were not really essential for studying how to predict and modify behavior. B.F. Skinner we'll talk about a lot in week 4 when we discuss, week 6 when we discuss learning. He has many famous experiments such as this operant conditioning chamber or the Skinner box that he used to demonstrate learning principles with rats. So after behaviorism, we have psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory, as you may know, was largely pioneered by the work of Sigmund Freud. He was an Austrian neurologist who was fascinated by patients who were suffering from hysteria, painful physical symptoms, and emotional disturbances that had no apparent physical cause that could not be otherwise explained. And so because he was seeing people with unexplained symptoms, he theorized that many of his patients' problems didn't arise from something conscious that they could name or put a finger on, but likely came from something unconscious, something deeper going on beneath their conscious mind. And he believed that the unconscious mind could be accessed through various types of experimental techniques, such as analyzing people's dreams, free association, having people freely think of whatever words or thoughts will come to their minds, as well as through Freudian slips, the name that was given after him. He didn't call it that, to seemingly innocent slips of the tongue. An example of a Freudian slip, a quick example, I'm sure many of us have experienced this, perhaps maybe in elementary school, where you might have, you're in class and you might accidentally say to your teacher, mom, if you have a female teacher and accidentally refer to them from an improper with an improper name, and someone who follows a psychoanalytic theory would say that, oh, well, that's because subconsciously, unconsciously, that child is associating that female teacher with their or associating those characteristics with the same characteristics as their mom, and it's some unconscious process that reveals itself through these accidental sayings in real life. Uh, but psychoanalytic theory, highly influential in the field of psychology, but not commonly used today. I think it's a common misconception that most psychologists today are actively using or applying Freudian slips or dream analysis or these kinds of things. A more common approach to these kinds of ideas is called psychodynamic psychology. So just to give a quick example of that we'll talk about later, between the differences of Freud's psychoanalytic theory and more modern psychodynamic approaches. In psychoanalytic theory, particularly within the context of providing therapy or trying to help people with various forms of mental illness, the psychotherapist was always anonymous. If you go back briefly, you'll often think there's often this perspective or this idea that people have of how therapy is conducted, and it's with someone laying back in a chair and a therapist leaning over them or kind of out of sight and just asking them to dream or imagine things or talk about their childhood. And that's not typically what happens in therapy today. In modern psychodynamic therapy, more commonly it happens that the patient and the therapist sit face to face, and there might be some exploration of childhood experiences or traumatic experiences, but more commonly in modern psychodynamic approaches, it's more about current relationships, less about what happened to you in the past, and more about how unconscious processes reveal themselves in your current relationships, including the relationship between the client and the therapist. And finally, in psychoanalysis, change occurs or relief occurs from gaining insight into some problem, whereas in psychodynamic therapy, change occurs via some corrective emotional experiences. We'll talk about this more likely in the chapter 16. After psychoanalytic theory came humanism. In the early 20th century, particularly in the United States, psychology was dominated by behaviorism and psychoanalytic theory. These two opposing camps that were very rigid and had a very strong schools of thought that kind of opposed each other. And many psychologists caught in the middle between these two felt that these two approaches were limited. That behaviorism was too reductionistic. Behaviorists would say that behavior and everything about psychology is entirely determined by the environment. In psychoanalytic theory, they believe that behavior was entirely determined by the unconscious mind. Two things that are way out of control or that felt way out of control to most American psychologists in the early 20th century. And so this framework of humanism emerged, and it really put humans in the driver's seat. It's all about how do humans reach their own full potential? How can they use their own potential for good and their own conscious abilities to reach their potential? And it's hypothesized that distress occurs when humans are prevented from reaching their potential. And so prominent humanists were Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So you've likely heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a very, very popular framework early on in the history of psychology. That is another one that isn't commonly referred to or used in modern psychological approaches. But he basically theorized that every human has a hierarchy of needs that need to be met in order to reach one's full potential, self-actualization, and that the lower level needs, such as food, water, shelter, or even family, friendship, intimacy, needed to be reached before someone could fully achieve their full potential. Um, And then Carl Rogers, who was a pioneer of client-centered psychotherapy, and he really came with a vastly different approach to psychoanalytic forms of therapy. In psychoanalysis, where the therapist engages in this deep investigation, kind of poking and prodding at the person's unconscious mind. In client-centered therapy, just as the name kind of suggests, instead it's the patient who kind of takes the lead and kind of leads in the direction that they want to go into. Carl Rogers really advocated that people can work through their own problems and just need a little help, just need a little bit of guidance. And they just need these three key factors in order to help people achieve their potential. Unconditional positive regard, providing a warm and positive environment for the person to thrive in, not judging them negatively in any way. So if a patient were to say, you know what, I harmed myself. I started cutting my wrists because I was so sad. Someone who's using Rogerian or this client-centered psychotherapy approach would refrain from saying anything like, "Oh, that's bad," or "Oh, you shouldn't do that," and would instead say, "Okay, I understand why you may have felt like doing that. Okay," and it really portray everything in a positive light to lift that person up, no matter how far low they've gone, and also using techniques such as making sure that there's a genuine relationship between the patient and the therapist, and making sure that the therapist expresses empathy explicitly throughout the session. And so his ideas about psychotherapy were really, really prominent in the development of psychology as a field. And then lastly, there was the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution um, uh, as we previously described, the earliest psychologists studied cognition. Those who were structuralists and those who were functionalists were primarily interested in how the human mind works, either the individual parts of the mind or how those parts of the mind function together. To give us to help us adapt to our environment, but starting in the 1950s, the development of new technologies completely revolutionized how people study the mind and behavior. Things like neuroimaging or computerized text analysis allow us to do so much more complex experiments and have a better understanding of different parts of the brain and how these parts of the brain work together. And so the cognitive revolution is our current framework, really, for understanding psychology. The most advanced and top-notch studies in psychology will typically rely on some computerized techniques to help us understand the brain and behavior. And so this class will largely focus on the three most foundational perspectives in psychology today, which are the behavioral perspective, the cognitive perspective, as well as the biological perspective. Largely, in this class, we will be examining how our brains, our biology, gives rise to our thoughts, our beliefs, and emotions, our cognition, in other words, as well as how it gives rise to our actions and our personality traits, different aspects of behavior.